So the reasoning behind this research project is essentially that in Western political discourse in particular, there has been an assumption that Islamic religiosity and a notion excessive Islamic religiosity in particular has potential problems for multicultural societies. It's almost like a hypothesis that the more religious someone is and the more visibly someone is in terms of his religiosity or her religiosity, then there is the greater potential for that person not only not being able to integrate socially and politically within the local environment within which they happen to live, but more importantly that there is also a risk of disengagement and possibly radicalization, even in some cases political violence. So I think the research was trying to, one, understand how does religiosity in the West manifest, and two, test this hypothesis that says excessive Islamic religiosity may lead to some negative and adverse outcomes in relation to individual Muslims who live in the West. So I think that's the broader kind of context for the study. But of course, we know also that in relation to Muslims in the West, there are two problems. One is the rise of extremism, and in particular violent extremism, and all the attention that brings upon Islam and Muslim communities. And two, perhaps linked to that, is the rising of Islamophobia and discrimination in general in Western societies. And I think it's probably the coincidence that we are seeing a problem of security that is taking place, obviously in the Middle East, but it is spilling over into Western polities. And that problem has perhaps fed into another rising social problem, which is racial intolerance and race relations in general, which have taken a dip. So the research was conducted into two parts, so to speak. So there is the cross-sectional kind of ethnographic investigation of Islamic religiosity in the West. And what is really interesting in relation to the findings is most individual Muslims, be they women, men, slightly younger, slightly older, see absolutely no contradiction between the values and the ethos of their religious identity and between those values and laws of the jurisdictions within which they live. Meaning basically that there is no problem of incompatibility between them being a Muslim who lives by the authentic values of their faith and the set of laws, domestic laws, by which they have to abide and live by. And I think that is very, very important, because often those who think there is a problem, they play on the card of the incompatibility of those two sets of values. And I think that's very, very interesting and very important to report here. Now, in relation to what does religiosity do to individuals, we found that on the whole, and the great majority of those interviewed and those surveyed report positive outcomes as a result of practicing their faith, as a result of engaging in rituals. So some of the words they associate with those rituals and those practices are openness, hope, acceptance, tolerance, wanting to engage cross-culturally, wanting to engage inter-religiously, so to speak. So I think that's very important. The second part of the study was much more quantitative and surveyed randomly more than 1,000 Australians about issues to do with their attitudes vis-a-vis Islam and Muslims in Australia. I think that's also very revealing, because what we then find is that the opinion polls, the research evidence that has been circulating in relation to racism and Islamophobia in particular are actually supported by what we did here. To give you some examples, in relation to asking Australians randomly whether they would be happy or accept having Muslims as their neighbors. And of course, we asked the same question in relation to other faith communities. So we said Christians, Jewish, Buddhist, Muslims, so that the emphasis is not just on Muslims. And really the findings are quite startling, because almost the ratio of negative attitudes towards Muslim or rejections of Muslims living in the local neighborhood goes by a factor of 4. So in some cases, if you aggregate the very negative or negative, you get close to 24% for Muslims. But when you look at, let's say, the Buddhist, that figure is around 6 to 7%. Yeah. So it's clearly there is a much more disproportionate negative attitude towards Muslims. Similarly, when we ask questions about would you accept having a mosque in your neighborhood as opposed to a synagogue, a temple, or a church, again, we found that the disproportionate negative responses vis-a-vis Muslims was in most cases twice as high as it was for other religious institutions or buildings. So that shows really that there is a problem here in relation to how the mainstream society in general view Islam and Islamic institutions and Muslims by extension, and that more needs to be done in this space to really show that, as the first piece of research has shown, that those supposed differences and contradictions and incompatibilities do not exist in reality, and that Muslims in the West are actually Western Muslims, and therefore they live and apply and practice their faith in ways that reflect the environments within which they happen to live. So I think that's a core finding of the study. What is surprising, perhaps, is the level of negativity vis-a-vis a particular community in relation to, in comparison to other communities. So I think the proportionality of negative attitudes is much higher than many of us would have expected. You expect it to be slightly higher, but not in some cases by a factor of 4. I think that's really, in my view, it just means there is a deeper problem that we need to face up to, and there's a big challenge that we have to try to overcome and combat. But what's also surprising on the positive side of things is that you see this strong positivity from Muslim Australians, Muslim French, American Muslims in relation to how they embrace the challenge of wanting to belong, wanting to disrupt and resist some of these racist and some of these quite unacceptable attitudes and behaviors. So they actually engage more, they embrace more, they want to showcase that their practice and their faith in general engenders positive outcomes. What we really hope the report would be able to do is that we have empirical evidence, we have very much incisive insights into how Western Islam, how Australian Islam is practiced by its adherents, by its followers. And I think a lot of those findings would seem to refute, reject, and debunk a lot of the myths that we hear in some media, and a lot of the foundations upon which intolerance and discrimination are built. And I think we hope that people will take note of the research findings, in particular policymakers and opinion makers. And I think the more we disseminate, the more we explain that ultimately individuals who happen to be Muslims are no different from other individuals or other citizens who happen to be of Jewish or Buddhist or Christian backgrounds, and that to link a faith tradition to individual acts of terrorism that take place elsewhere, I think has been very damaging to our society. And I think the research is, in addition to its obviously contribution to knowledge in this space, aims and hopes to make a contribution in relation to how we view these public debates.